Usually I live at Sera in South India, but this year has been quite unusual. I think it's probably been unusual for everybody. Um, so just a little background. I met with Lama Zopa Rinpoche back in January at Root Institute in Bodh and Rinpoche said, because we have, from Sera, we have a couple of months of vacation in the winter. So Rinpoche said, it's good if you can go to Maratika in Nepal and do a retreat. So I went to Nepal, came to Nepal in February and went up to Maratika, which is in the east, very remote area, and was able to find a place to do retreat that was kind of up the mountain a bit from the town. So I was quite isolated. And I was in retreat there until April. And I came down one day late in March to town to buy some things. And the streets were all deserted and all the windows were boarded up. So I didn't know what was going on. There was only one man I saw on the street. He looked at me kind of suspiciously. What are you doing here? So I didn't really, I suspected something was going on. I thought maybe it was a holiday. So I went back up to where I was in retreat and then wrote a message to Venerable Sarah, who was down at Maratika at the monastery. And then she explained to me a little bit about what was going on. So I think, I assumed, well, maybe in a couple of weeks, everything will be back to normal. I can go back to Sarah once the retreat is finished. But actually, even from when I went back up that afternoon to where I was in retreat, it took a month before I could come down to the monastery, which was only half an hour walk away, because the town was on lockdown. And actually, I was not supposed to be where I was because all the foreigners were supposed to have registered already and been in the monastery. So it took a while. And then I came down to the monastery in Maratika in April and thought, hopefully in about a month or two, I can get back to Sera. So I was in Maratika until September. And finally, Lama Zopa Rinpoche called us and said, you should come to Kopan. So we made it down here to Kopan, which is a very good place to be. If I can't be at Sera, this is the second best place to be for what we're doing, trying to continue our studies. And actually, there was an outbreak of COVID at Sera. 50 monks were sick. So in some sense, it's perhaps fortunate that I'm away from there. India is in a very bad condition right now, and especially where we are in South India, that Karnataka state has got a lot of cases. So where we are here, fortunately, Kopan is quite isolated, quarantined. So anyway, I was as I mentioned, I was stuck in Maratika until September, and I didn't have any of my supplies and books with me. I had only brought one book with me, which was Nagarjuna's sixfold collection of reasoning, because I thought while I was in retreat, I would memorize a little bit of it. And so I was stuck there. So I decided, when I got down to the monastery, I'll just keep memorizing it. I had not much else to do with my time. So I ended up memorizing the sixfold collection of reasoning this year. And then now I'm trying to understand it. This is how we do things in the monastery. First, we memorize it, and then we think about it. So you have to, takes a long time to get some idea of what these teachings are talking about. First you hear about it, then you think about it, and then finally you have some understanding. You can meditate on it. So I thought, it would be good to teach a course on at least one of these 6 texts so that I can study it myself. I'll be forced to think about it. And maybe if there's time in the future, I would like to teach on some of the others as well. So I'll explain what these texts are, the sixfold collection of reasoning, as we get into the talk. So I have paired, I should just also mention, this is the first time I've taught on Zoom. Actually, probably the first time I've really used Zoom. Last Saturday, I had a phone conversation with somebody from Wisdom Publications. That was the first time I used it. Now it's a week later, and I'm here again using it, really fully for the first time. And so I thought, while we're doing this way, it would be good to have a PowerPoint presentation to keep everyone engaged. And I'm quite happy with how this turned out. So I think maybe in the future, even if I teach in public, it's good to have this kind of thing. Usually Buddhist teachings, we just talk and talk and talk about all these philosophical concepts, but having a little bit of something visual to keep your mind focused and some pictures can be helpful. So here we are, Nagarjuna's 70 stanzas on emptiness. Okay. So a lot of you might have heard about the Nalanda tradition. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often talks about this. He likes to use this distinction, we say Pali and Sanskrit Buddhism, as opposed to the more traditional way of referring to Hinayana and Mahayana, because that's a bit derogatory. The word Hinayana literally means small vehicle or lesser vehicle, and Mahayana means great vehicle. But he points out that it's not meant to be derogatory, that actually it's the foundational vehicle. We could think about it that way. But in any case, people in countries where Theravada Buddhism is practiced, which is what the Tibetans would technically call Hinayana, you don't really like this term because it's understandably, it makes it sound as though one is better than the other. It's really just two different approaches to the Buddha's teachings. And so His Holiness likes to talk about it as the Pali tradition, because the Buddhism is practiced mostly in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, parts of Vietnam, Laos, and especially also Sri Lanka, is based on the Pali tradition coming out of India. And then Buddhism as it's practiced in Tibet, Mongolia, also in East Asia and China, Japan, Korea, is more strongly based on the Sanskrit tradition. The texts were translated from Sanskrit. And even in India, in ancient times, these traditions were quite different in their approach. So it's natural that as they've spread to other countries, that they still have a different approach. So we see here the Pali tradition, the emphasis is, as we see, receive and transmit an authentic tradition without adding or subtracting. The idea is that we see the Pali tradition really looks to the way that the Buddha lived at his time as something that is to be emulated, that the Buddha was a beggar and lived in the forest, and therefore monks should do the same thing. And the Buddha did not engage in a lot of scholarly activity. There actually was no written language at the time of the Buddha. So they see that as essential to the tradition, to maintain that. And then if you look at Buddhism as it's practiced in Southeast Asia, in a lot of places, it's very similar to how the Buddha probably practiced. Some monks live in the forest and come out to beg every day.
Sorry, Venerable, we can't
Yes.
see your PDF, your PowerPoint. You need to click on it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Can you see it now?
Double click on it.
No.
You just need to open it.
Okay, I said I pressed share, mail, messages, airdrop, notes. No, that's not
desktop. Yeah, you have it shared, but you just need to open the PowerPoint or the PDF.
It is open on my screen. It's all showing.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
You probably shared only part of the screen, the wrong part of the screen. You probably should share the PDF itself open.
I did send it to her.
Folder page needs to be minimized first so that we can
folder
see
page. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not so proficient with Macs. This is Senla's computer. So how do we?
So the page that is shown with all the folders, files, which also had the PowerPoint, maybe you have to minimize it.
Is it? Can you see that? You can see that folder, can you?
Yes, all of us. Yes.
You can still see the folder now?
Yes, yes.
It's because I just closed the folder.
The folder that has all the files.
Yeah, I just closed it.
Yeah, you can probably minimize it. Yeah.
No, it's already minimized on my screen.
Oh, so
all that I see.
us.
Yeah.
end the screen share, and then when you start it again, you should be able to open immediately the PDF without going to the file. So if you end screen share.
Oh, end screen share.
Yeah. And then when you choose it again.
Okay.
And then now share screen again.
Okay.
And is there an option to share the screen?
Yeah, I just did. You can see it now?
Now we see it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, so yeah, I'll go back to the first slide briefly. This was the introduction I showed, and now, yeah, here's the Nalanda tradition I was talking about. Okay, so I don't think you missed anything because I just read out, this Pali tradition. So I mentioned, there's the Pali tradition, and now there's the Sanskrit tradition, but especially the Nalanda tradition. Nalanda was a monastic university in India, in Bihar, not so far from Bodh Gaya. And there were other monastic universities also, especially Vikramashila and Odantapuri were two other major ones. And there was another one also named Vallabhi on the west coast, which was actually Pali tradition. But Nalanda is the main university that Tibetan Buddhism bases itself upon. And so as you see in the Nalanda tradition, use reasoning to examine and question the teachings, gain new insights, and generate one's own conclusions. Think outside the box. Consider how these traditional teachings can be applied to modern dilemmas, and engage in dialogue with other disciplines like philosophy, psychology, and science. Focus on great compassion, benefit for all beings. So this is the major difference, is that in the Nalanda tradition, the idea is that reason is supreme. Even if something was said by the Buddha or it's a tradition, it's not to be taken as true if we can't establish it by reason. And if we can establish something by reason, then even if it's not found in the traditional teachings, we can still accept it. So even in ancient India, about 1,000 years after the Buddha, when the Nalanda was first getting started, India was a very different place than it had been at the time of the Buddha. And so there was a question, should we continue to live as these ascetic beggars and not really engage with society? Or should we engage with the changing times? Because in India, there was now a big movement towards these great universities. There were a lot of Vedic tradition universities, following the Vedas. We say Hinduism today, but actually at the time, there was no concept of Hinduism. They were just different religious groups, many of whom followed the Vedas as their authority. And they started, especially the study of logic and arguing with each other. And it would only take somebody seriously if they could defend their position with logic. So as His Holiness the Dalai Lama points out, the world is also a very different place now. And what is really considered as a means of understanding the world are these disciplines, especially psychology and science, and to some extent philosophy. So if Buddhism wants to engage with the world, we need to take these disciplines seriously and engage in dialogue with them. And as His Holiness says, even if science proves something in Buddhism to be wrong, then we need to discard that. It's not that we just take the Buddhist tradition as true and then try to prove that to scientists that Buddhism is true. It's that we actually, from our side, are trying to understand how things really are. And also the focus on great compassion is important because it's understood that if you only want to achieve self-liberation, it's adequate simply to meditate on your own. But to achieve full enlightenment, it's not possible to do that without actually thinking a lot about a lot of different things. This is how it's very clear in the traditional teachings, especially in the text called the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara, or the collection of the Mahayana Sutras. It's said to be composed by Maitreya, the Buddha Maitreya. It says very clearly that if you don't study other non-Buddhist disciplines and gain a thorough understanding of all knowledge in the world, then how do you expect to be a knower of all, a Buddha, right? It's not that you're just going to magically one day wake up and know everything. If you want to understand everything, you have to think about things and look at different ways of understanding different disciplines. So we see here the picture of Nalanda. It was actually, the ruins were uncovered in the 1840s, I believe. Somebody found this, this enormous place, and it took quite a while to figure out what it was, but they eventually identified that it was indeed the Nalanda University that had been very famous in India. It had Indians had no longer knew where it was, but it was still very much important part of their history, because in the first millennium, this was the biggest university in the world. People came from all over, not obviously Western Europe, but even maybe parts of Eastern Europe, like Greece, people may have come. And then also, of course, all of Asia, China, Japan, Iran, which was a Buddhist country, Afghanistan. People came to Nalanda to study. So then we have Nagarjuna, who was a great Buddhist philosopher. And as you'll see from my notes about Nagarjuna, it's not really clear when or where he lived. This is part of the issue with Indian history. India had an enormous philosophical tradition and religious tradition. They did not have a very strong tradition of keeping historical records. So we don't really know a lot about what happened in India in ancient times. We have just philosophical text. From those, we can then try to infer what actually happened. So we see that Nagarjuna probably lived sometime in the first half of the first millennium. People say, most scholars say around maybe 100 to 200 CE AD, and probably taught at Nalanda. Now, when we say Nalanda, it's not the university probably, because Nalanda University proper, it seems, wasn't maybe first funded until the 4th or the 5th century. But the place Nalanda actually existed at the time of the Buddha. The Buddha even taught there. This word Nalanda, it translates, it seems, as charity without intermission. And the Buddha said that this was a great place, to teach. And other teachers subsequently taught there and continuing after the Buddha. So it seems that Nagarjuna actually was there with his main student Aryadeva and their students. But there was no university proper there. It was really just, I think, maybe a bunch of mango groves and some towns. And then we say that he was one of the great two charioteers, meaning that of all the great pundits, the great scholars of Nalanda, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said that there were 17 that he considers the most important. You'll see there's a prayer he composed to the 17 Panditas. And of these, 2 are called charioteers, Nagarjuna and Asanga, because they really found a new way of interpreting the Buddhist teachings that was unprecedented. And therefore, all other commentators after that followed either one of the 2 of them. So Nagarjuna founded the Middle Way school, and Asanga founded the Mind-Only school. All other scholars in India belong to one of these 2 schools. All other, we say, Mahayana scholars, people, following the Mahayana tradition of trying to achieve full enlightenment. And I've mentioned here also Joseph Waltzer's book. He was actually my professor in college back in the US, and he wrote an excellent book on Nagarjuna. So if anyone's interested in a historical account, as I said, it's very hard to piece together, but I think he's done a very good job of trying to see what evidence we do have, who this person was and when he lived. But as one of my teachers at Sarah once told me, what's wonderful about the Buddhist tradition is that in the end, it really doesn't matter when or where he lived. For some religious traditions, say, for example, Christianity, the historicity of Jesus is very important. Whether or not Jesus rose from the dead is central to the Christian religion. And so Christians will obviously go to a great length to try to prove this. Whereas in Buddhism, even if there was never any person named Nagarjuna and his writings were all put together by somebody else, it really makes no difference whatsoever. All that matters is that they are true and they can withstand reason and that they have efficacy for personal practice. So Nagarjuna composed a number of texts, and in the Tibetan tradition, we usually group them into 4 different categories. So we have what's called the collection of reasoning, which are texts, mainly trying to establish emptiness through reasoning. And then we have the collection of praises or hymns. So Nagarjuna composed a lot of hymns or praises to the Buddha, mainly. Also, he composed praise to emptiness, or praise to Dharmadatta, it's called. And these texts also, you'll find, if you read them, are very heavily focused on emptiness. This seems to be his style. And he'll say, such and such thing about emptiness, and therefore I praise the Buddha who taught it. but there's less emphasis on establishing it through reasoning. It's more just saying how wonderful this is that the Buddha taught that. And then there's a collection of advice. So one of the major texts that some of you might know is called Letter to a Friend, where Nagarjuna composed advice to a practitioner, who I believe actually was a king. And then there's the collection of scriptural citations. He has a text called the Compendium of Sutras, where he collects different quotes from the Buddha's sutras to try to prove that the Buddha taught what he's teaching in the collection of reasoning, these teachings on emptiness, to show a basis for that in the traditional teachings. So the sixfold collection of reasoning, see there's 6 texts. So some scholars in Tibet consider that there were only fivefold collection of reasoning, only 5 texts. But Nagarjuna, Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug school, he decided that there actually should be a 6th one included, called the Precious Garland, which is also a letter of advice to a king, like the Letter to a Friend. But what's different than Letter to a Friend is that Precious Garland has a lot of teachings on emptiness. The 1st, 2nd, and 4th chapters of this 5-chapter text all have extensive explications of emptiness. So he considers that this should be considered part of the sixfold collection of reasoning. So in this, we have first 2 texts are 2 texts specifically negating inherent existence. So Root Wisdom of the Middle Way, which negates the subject matter of true existence propounders. So root wisdom, it said it's called root because it's the foundation of all of the others. We talk about the sixfold collection of reasoning. It's all based on this one text, root wisdom. The other ones are like branches to that. And it specifically negates inherent existence and establishes emptiness. This next text called finely woven, it also could be translated as finely ground, negates the arguments of true existence propounders. So this, rather than focusing on saying why is true existence not right, it's then people who argue that true existence is real use different arguments, and then showing how their arguments are flawed. This is a very short text. It's only about 6 pages, actually. Next, we have 70 stanzas in emptiness, as I mentioned, 2 texts affirming conventionalities within the context of emptiness. So, although things are empty of inherent existence, that doesn't mean they don't exist at all, and things can still function on a conventional level. So 2 of the texts focus mainly on that. 70 stanzas in emptiness, which affirms generally that things can function, that cause and effect can function. And it's considered to be a digression from the 7th chapter of Root Wisdom, the 7th chapter being called Birth, Abiding, and Disintegration. And then another text, Dispeller of Disputes, which is approximately the same length, I think it's only about 80 stanzas, affirms how arguments can still negate wrong views. Because somebody argues, well, if everything's empty, then your words are empty and your argument's empty. So what are you arguing against with? How are you negating my view? You have nothing there. But he's saying that just because the words are empty doesn't mean that they can't negate things. It still can function to do that. And this is considered a digression from chapter 1 of Root Wisdom, which is the chapter is called Conditions. And then finally, 2 texts showing how the mind realizing emptiness brings liberation. So the first 4 texts were focused on, we say, the object, emptiness. Now it's focused on the subject, realizing emptiness. The first is 60 stanzas on reasoning, which shows how even Hinayana practitioners must realize emptiness to attain liberation. So this is actually a very important point, because some people would argue, for example, one of Nagarjuna's students, even Vibhaviveka, argued that emptiness is necessary to achieve enlightenment for a Mahayana practitioner, but is not necessary for somebody to achieve self-liberation, that somebody can simply realize the selflessness of a person. They don't have to realize emptiness. But it seems quite likely that Vibhaviveka was wrong, because Vibhaviveka in terms of interpreting Nagarjuna, because he was a commentator, because if you read this text, 60 stanzas of reasoning, it really seems quite clear that Nagarjuna is saying that even in the traditional teachings, we say the Pali Canon, the Buddha was talking about emptiness, although it's not so clear as it is in the Mahayana texts, the ones that are in Sanskrit. It does actually, he shows a very with a lot of very clear examples, why when the Buddha said self, he didn't mean a person. When he said things are empty of self, by self he meant an independent existence that doesn't rely on other things. And when he said all phenomena are selfless, he said that all phenomena don't have this kind of self. It's not just people that don't have this self. So this text talks about how even Hinayana practitioners, how they must meditate in emptiness. And then Precious Garland, which I said is very different from the others. It's longer and it contains a lot of non-emptiness topics. The other ones are just from the start to the finish, it's all about emptiness. Precious Garland is a letter to a king about how to rule properly. But it also does show how Mahayana practitioners meditate on emptiness. As I mentioned, there are extensive explanations of emptiness in this text, but there's also the 5th chapter of this text, the last chapter, is extensively about the Bodhisattva path and the stages one goes through. So it's considered to complete the 6-fold collection by making it not only about the wisdom side of the path, but also has a teaching on the method side of the path. And so I'll quote, as we go through the teaching, actually, I'll quote a number of other texts, but especially Root Wisdom, because that's the central text, and Precious Garland, because it has a lot of points on practice that are not included in the other texts. Okay, so focusing on 70 stanzas, there were 3 main commentaries that were translated into Tibetan. And actually, 70 stanzas itself, unlike Root Wisdom, which we have found Sanskrit fragments, and also Root Wisdom was translated into Chinese. 70 stanzas, we've lost the Sanskrit. Nobody's ever found it. So we have to piece together the Sanskrit based on the Tibetan. And in Tibetan, we don't actually have the text translated by itself. It's only translated within the context of 3 commentaries that were translated into Tibetan. So the first one is called the auto commentary, but I have this in quotations because it probably wasn't actually written by Nagarjuna. It says in the colophon, the commentary on 70 stanzas by Nagarjuna, but there, most Tibetans consider that it was not composed by Nagarjuna for a number of reasons. The main reason being that none of Nagarjuna's students mention it. They talk about texts that Nagarjuna composed, and none of them talk about this text. And secondly, that Chandrakirti, who wrote the second commentary, he interprets the root text very differently than the author of this first commentary. And if he had considered that Nagarjuna had written the auto commentary, he would have followed it very closely because he was trying to explain Nagarjuna's reasoning. But since he explained the meaning very differently, it shows that he didn't consider that first text to have been written by Nagarjuna. So Chandrakirti lived probably in the 7th century, and Tsongkhapa especially considers him to have been the greatest commentator on Nagarjuna's work. So I'll also quote him quite a lot as we go through, because he makes a lot of points very clear that are not so clear in Nagarjuna's root text. And then we have a commentary by Parahita, who was a contemporary of Atisha, the great scholar who brought the second wave of Buddhism to Tibet in the 11th century. And it seems Parahita might actually have traveled to Tibet also with Atisha. So he also wrote a commentary on the 70 stanzas. So now, as you see, we have Chandrakirti right away. I want to start by talking about what it means. Why is it important to meditate on emptiness? Because I think this point often gets lost. Many of you might have received teachings on emptiness, saying, oh, the flower doesn't exist from its own side. You can't find the pot. And you might think, well, why does that matter? Whether there's a pot or not, whether there's a self or not, does it really have any effect on how I live my life? Or does it have anything to do with being free from suffering? So I think a point that is often not emphasized is that for ordinary people, even if they gain an conceptual understanding of emptiness, it won't have a lot of effect right away. And so I say that not to be discouraging, but so that we understand, why, we don't have unrealistic expectations about what was going to happen if we have an understanding of emptiness. So we have here Chandrakirti talking about the right receptacle for emptiness, meaning the person to whom you should teach emptiness. And he says that this person, so I'll read this verse, and I'll just want to comment briefly before I read it. You'll see throughout this text, throughout the presentation, every quotation I give is in verse. All of these authors wrote in poetry. This is also something I think that it gets lost sometimes. So personally, I feel that's actually very important. I don't think that we should translate it in English, if possible, without losing that element of it, because they consider that in a way of understanding, a way of communicating something, and also a way of keeping something in memory. If something is in poetry, it's more likely to stay in our minds. So they composed in verse. The Indian scholars and neither the Tibetan scholars use rhyme. So I never tried to translate in rhyme, but I have tried to translate every verse translation into English meter. So you'll see usually if any of you know poetry, iambic tetrameter or pentameter. But Chandrakirti uses actually a very complicated verse. So you'll see this is a little complex, but the other ones will be a little bit more straightforward. So anyway, Chandrakirti says about the person who is the right receptacle for emptiness. When even as a common being, this person hears of emptiness, from deep within, a fervent joy repetitively does arise. Arising from this fervent joy come tears that make his eyes moist and his body hairs all stand on end. Somebody like this has in mind the seed of total Buddhahood. So he's saying that if somebody has this reaction, when they hear about emptiness, they start crying and they're overjoyed. They feel like I found this precious jewel. This is the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. Then it shows that they have a very strong imprint from previous lives, and they'll have the capacity to realize emptiness in this life, and that you should teach emptiness to this person. So in the context of this verse, in the monastery we study this, then the question comes up, two things. One is, well, then should none of us learn about emptiness? Because if we don't have this reaction, does that mean that we're not the right receptacle? And secondly, it becomes a bit of a logical fallacy that if somebody has this experience because they learned about emptiness in a past life, well, then how do they ever begin? If you don't teach somebody emptiness unless they have this experience, but they can't have this experience without having learned about it in the past life, then where do you start? So usually, we understand this to mean that a person who has this experience is the one who will actually have a full realization of emptiness in this life, and could achieve liberation. For other people, it doesn't mean we shouldn't learn about emptiness. We have to start somewhere, and it's that we make the imprint now, such that in the future we'll be able to be at this level. So again, it's not meant to be discouraging. It's not meant to say, we can't have any experience, but it's meant to emphasize this is a very long-term process. Most Buddhists don't get enlightened in this life. If we have the idea that if I study about emptiness, then in a few years I'm going to be free of all attachment and suffering and pain, this is unrealistic. If we work very hard, we can have some experience, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, a lot of patience. It's also said that this is the highest capacity being. There are also some people who have imprints, but not as strong. They're not quite as high capacity. And when they hear about emptiness, they feel fear. They feel that I'm going to cease existing or something like that. And that's actually said to also be a good sign. It shows that they have some understanding of what's really being said. But for most people, they hear about it and they'll either think, huh? Or just think, okay, that makes sense, but what does it matter? So it doesn't mean we take this on faith. The point is that, we can access the Buddha's teachings in a lot of ways. And for some of us, emptiness might not be, so immediately meaningful, but a lot of the Buddhist teachings are. The Buddhist teachings on compassion, on impermanence, on practice of patience, on the downfalls, the drawbacks of following sense pleasures, things like this. And then we can have some sense that, if the Buddha taught these teachings of emptiness too, it's worth investigating. It's worth really checking it out. And it's something we can get an intellectual understanding of. And of course, that's why I'm talking about it. I hope that I can explain why this is really meaningful. But to also, of course, keep in mind just, that this is something that, that takes a lot of work and a lot of dedication over a long time. And so we go to the next slide here. And that's exactly what I'm trying to present, is that even doubt has benefit. Even if we don't immediately understand the meaning, as Aryadeva, who was the main student of Nagarjuna, says, with little merit beings won't have toward this Dharma even a doubt. To merely have a doubt can tear the fabric of existence here. So he's saying that even just thinking, maybe things don't exist the way they appear to me. Maybe there's some connection between my state of mind and my experience of the world. This sets a seed for having a realization, and it puts us on a path, because we start thinking of maybe there's something there. I want to follow that. I want to check up on that and see what that means. Now, sometimes, we might hear that doubt is a mental affliction. I think this can be a problem if we understand it that way, because we have the 6 main mental afflictions. One of them is doubt. But what's considered a mental affliction is afflictive doubt, meaning that it's like a cynicism. We hear about the teachings and we think that doesn't make any sense. I don't really, I think that's just stupid. That's a major obstacle. Or also kind of self-doubt, where we think I can't do this. I'm not good enough to do this. This is said to be one of the major obstacles to entering the path, is to think, I don't know. I've always been in this state of questioning and not being able to have some kind of determination. But to have a doubt in the sense of, maybe there's something worthwhile here pursuing. This is considered to be the foundation of the practice, the most important foundation. It's actually better to have that than to immediately think, oh, I believe everything. It said that if we immediately think that, then it shows we haven't really analyzed it. And eventually we might start having doubt that can derail us, because we're not used to that. But if at the start we enter this with a healthy kind of skepticism, then we can really gain something out of it. So next we have Nagarjuna describing the wrong receptacle for emptiness. This is from his root wisdom. By wrongly viewing emptiness, the feeble-minded wreck themselves, like wrongly handling deadly snakes, or wrongly casting magic spells. So his point being that this is a profound teaching, and if we don't approach it correctly, we can misinterpret it, and that can actually be very dangerous. In the last talk, I will explain more clearly about how that can manifest, but this is a serious thing. It's not just like, sort of a metaphor. This can happen. People can understand emptiness to mean nothing matters, life is meaningless, or especially that there's no such thing as karma. I will talk very soon about karma. I think when we talk about emptiness, really what we're talking about is karma. It's just another way of, it's like 2 sides of the same coin. We say emptiness, independent origination. Independent origination is mainly karma. It's about if we say that things are experienced because of karma, it's basically saying that our mind is creating the world. This is a very profound statement. What does that mean, and how could that happen? For a lot of us, in the modern world, there's a strong sense that maybe science has already disproved that could possibly happen. So we'll talk about that. But if that can happen, we have to have some way of understanding it. And different Buddhist scholars describe that in different ways. The Middle Way school talked about emptiness as their way of understanding how this works. So if we understand emptiness to mean that therefore there's no self and therefore nothing reincarnates, and therefore no cause and effect of actions, this completely misses the point and is actually dangerous, because we'll reject the teachings. It said, Charandakirti, in his commentary on this verse, he says that there's 2 ways to wrongly handle emptiness. One is that we understand it to mean nothingness, that we therefore fall into nihilism. And the second is that we therefore think that the Buddha was wrong. We hear the teachings in emptiness and we think this is bogus. This person was crazy, and we thereby reject the Buddha. So in either case, this can be a danger in misunderstanding what's being said. Now it's said that one cause for misunderstanding emptiness, as some of you might know, when we talk about the object of negation, it's said that we need to recognize what we're negating. So if we start using reasoning to say, oh, nothing exists inherently, this and that, without understanding what inherent existence would mean first, then we'll think that nothing exists. But if we first recognize the way that our mind is clinging on to an unreal way of existing, like a way that things can't exist. For example, we see an illusion, a horse, it looks like a horse. And somebody says there's no horse there. And you think, oh, there's nothing there at all, right? But if you know it's an illusion, you know that what was being negated is not that there's nothing there at all. There's some appearance, but that it's a horse. It's not actually a horse. It's just a trick of light. There is light there. It's not that nothing exists. So we have to be able to distinguish between what's being negated and what's not being negated. And if we can do that, it's much less likely to fall into nihilism. So then what does it mean, empty of inherent existence? And let me just mention also, this first talk I'm going to be talking mainly about just general points of emptiness. I'll get more into the text itself, 70 stanzas, hopefully in the second talk. I don't know exactly how things will go with the timing. As I said, I've never done a PowerPoint presentation before in this way, so I can't necessarily judge exactly how the time will work, but I'll try to get to the introductory points in the first talk. So in terms of, before we start talking about emptiness, we have to know what we mean by emptiness. So empty of inherent existence really means that when you search among the bases of designation, you cannot locate something that is the designated thing, or that is the referent for the term. So this sounds complex, but basically it means that if we look at the parts that compose something, or that really the parts on which something is designated, none of those parts in and of themselves, or even the collection of the parts, or something different from them, is that thing. And I'll show that with 6 examples very shortly. So even though none of those is that thing, the thing does exist conventionally, as opposed to something that doesn't exist at all. And traditionally in the teachings, we talk about rabbit's horns. A rabbit doesn't have horns, so there's no such thing as a rabbit horn. But a rabbit does have ears, so we could say rabbit ear does exist. So to exist conventionally, it must have 3 qualities. It must be renowned to worldly convention. So we all agree a rabbit exists. This is something that's renowned. It's known to the world. And we agree that rabbits have ears. We talk about rabbit ears. Nobody talks about rabbit horns. I hope not. Or at least we talk about it here only as an example of something that doesn't exist. Secondly, it must not be harmed by another conventional valid cognition. So nobody can prove that rabbits' ears don't exist using conventional logic. We can prove that a rabbit's horns don't exist. Actually, we don't even need to use reasoning. We can just see that with our eyes. So even if it was renowned that rabbits have horns, it's actually negated by valid cognition. So it doesn't fulfill these 3 qualities. So something else, for example, something else might be renowned. For example, in the world, it's renowned, at least to some people, that getting intoxicated is a joyful experience. So we could say, well, that's renowned in the world. But if we use reasoning, we can negate that. We can show that actually, in a lot of ways, getting intoxicated is very uncomfortable and very unhealthy. So this will come up later. We talk about the illusions that the world has. People think that I exist, that there's a self. People think that things are permanent. People think that things are that are actually suffering are pleasure. So those are renowned to the world, but they're harmed by conventional cognition. If we look more deeply, we can see that's not true. But in terms of rabbits' ears, that's true. No, rabbits have ears. Conventionally, that's true. But thirdly, it must also not be harmed by wisdom analyzing the ultimate. So this means wisdom analyzing the things that way things exist ultimately, whether they can be found on the basis of designation. So for example, we might talk about a self, an inherent self of person, that I exist, and I'll talk about this with the examples, but basically that there's an inherent me well, I might say it's different than my aggregates. And I can argue that philosophically, but in this system, we understand that that cannot be held up. There are various lines of reasoning that will negate that. And therefore, even though we might think it exists, it doesn't exist. So this is a bit abstract, but I hope with examples, we can make this more clear. And I'll give 6 examples that will be progressively more subtle. I think the first few will seem, when we think about it, are quite obvious what we mean by we cannot locate something. So the first example is time. So let's take the example of 4 o'clock. See, this clock is showing 4 o'clock. So if I ask you what is 4 o'clock, is the clock 4 o'clock? And you'd probably say, no, the clock is not 4 o'clock. But say that here in Nepal, it's 4 o'clock, right? Conventionally, it's true. I'm right, it's 4 o'clock. It's not 5 o'clock, it's not 7 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock. But can you identify anything that's 4 o'clock? We say on the basis of a particular height of the sun in the sky and the way that it casts shadows on the earth, we can say conventionally that it's 4 o'clock. So the basis of designation are the earth, the curvature of the earth, the sun, the position of the sun, the different objects. We might say that, the building at 4 o'clock. That's correct. It's not that the building is 4 o'clock, but the building at 4 o'clock might look different than it looks the building at 10 o'clock because there's no sun shining on it. So the building is also a basis of designation. And we can talk about it, very precisely. We can say it's 4 o'clock, 4:01. We can measure time very precisely. We can use all kinds of mathematical formulas to predict things based on time. But can anybody actually find 4 o'clock and point it out among the bases of the designation? And so I have this other picture. This is the planet Mars. So think, what would it mean if I was on Mars and said, now it's 4 o'clock? Does that even have any meaning anymore? Let alone, it's 4 o'clock in Nepal, and maybe in the USA, it's 5:15 a.m. So it's not 4 o'clock. But on Mars, what does it even mean to say 4 o'clock? We only have 4 o'clock based on the Earth, right? On Mars, the day is a lot longer. So these concepts cease to have any meaning without the basis of designation there anymore. Now, still on Mars, if I was a space astronaut on Mars and I was communicating with Houston back on Earth, Houston could tell me, yeah, it's 4 o'clock. And I'd say, yeah, you're right, it's 4 o'clock. So it still in some sense has meaning, but it's very much divorced at that point. It's only based on, it's much easier perhaps when I'm on Mars to recognize that this is just a conceptual construct. And I think most of us can understand that. Nobody's going to argue, no, really there is 4 o'clock. It's this thing that I can point to, this solid thing. And you're wrong to say that it's just a conceptual construct. So the next example is money. It's a little more solid because we point to this $100 bill. We say that's money. The bill is money, right? But first of all, we have to think about how money first arose in the world. First there was gold, and gold had a particular value, which again, it had no inherent value. I've read recently about, for example, in South Dakota, some of you might know General George Custer, the famous general who was killed in the Battle of Little Bighorn. So he was wandering in they said the Indian Territory, or really say Native American or American Indian Territory, and he found in some mountains that there was some gold. And people went crazy when they heard about this, and they rushed to mine the gold. But the local native people thought they were crazy. What, you know, it's just these yellow rocks that we've always known they were there, but it doesn't mean anything to us. It has no use for us. But to the people of European descent, this was very valuable, and based on basically a conceptual construct. And later, they then made these notes, or they actually already obviously had at that point, that denoted, symbolized, you know, some amount of gold. So I could give you this piece of paper that symbolizes you now own the gold that I owned. And gradually that lost its connection with the gold itself, the gold standard. And it's just the pieces of paper that have value. But really, it's not the piece of paper that itself has value. You know, it depends on a social system that creates that value. You know, if the United States ceased to exist, this note would be nothing. It has to do with the value that people are projecting onto the note. Now, it's a projection, but that doesn't mean that the note is not money, right? We could say, okay, that's just a projection. Therefore, you know, that's not money. Money is just a concept and something in our minds. Whereas the paper is real. It's really paper. It's not really money, but it's really paper. But as I'll show with the further examples, the middle way understanding is that that's exactly the same thing. Any label we put on it depends on particular conceptual constructs. So you see this person here tearing the money in half. So then is it money anymore when it's torn in half? It no longer has any value. So where did the money go? You might say that the collection of the parts is money, but the collection of parts is still there when both halves are there. But it's somehow, you know, there's something that's no longer there. The money is no longer there. So the next example is countries. This is, again, a little more complex. So I'll take my country, the United States. So we'd ask, what is the United States? And some people might say, well, the United States, you know, it's a country that is south of Canada, north of Mexico. It was founded on July 4th, 1776. And it has, you know, 300 million plus people. You can make all kinds of statements, and they're all correct. You know, in reason anyway, maybe you may make some wrong statements, but everything I've just said is correct. But then we ask, well, what is it? You know, if we kind of try to find what is the United States, we see this map of the United States. Is that map the country? Obviously not. But is that land that's being symbolized by the map, is that the United States? You know, but what if all the people were gone, like 2,000 years from now? That land might still be there, but we'd say the United States is not there anymore. And then we have the buildings, like the very famous Statue of Liberty. We might say, well, the buildings are the United States, all the things that we've built up. You know, but that building wasn't there. I think the Statue of Liberty, maybe around 1890, was brought over from France. So, you know, very few of the buildings that are in the United States were there in 1776. And even if all the buildings from 1776 were destroyed, it wouldn't say, well, the United States is gone. It's still there. So then we have the land also. This is the Grand Canyon, a very famous monument, or not, very famous area in the United States, a tourist attraction. You know, but that is also not the United States for the reason I said before, but also if all the land was the United States, we have this problem that I'm looking at the Grand Canyon right now, and I say, I can see the United States, but I don't see all of the land. All I see is the Grand Canyon. I could also look at Niagara Falls in the Northeast and say, I see the United States. But again, I'm only looking at one piece of the land. I'm not looking at all of the land. And now we have the people below. You see the people waving flags before the Capitol Hill, I believe. Maybe that, yeah. So we'd say, okay, the people constitute the United States. Because of the country, we say, we the people. But again, none of the people who are there now were there 200 years ago. And the people are always changing. There's people coming in and out of the United States. you know, and if it was just the people, if there was some disaster and everyone fled to Mexico, as opposed to, you know, the other way is people are coming into the United States from Mexico. If everybody actually went over the border the other way and had to be refugees in Mexico, we wouldn't say that the United States is now in Mexico. You know, the United States, we'd say, oh, we left the United States to come to Mexico. So we have this sense that it's still back there with the land. So then we have we the people. You know, this is the Declaration of Independence, and I put that there because, you know, we could say, as I mentioned before, it's correct to say that when Thomas Jefferson composed the Declaration of Independence, that was the founding of the nation. This is when we celebrate the anniversary of our nation. But then if we analyze more closely, we would ask, well, did the country come into existence when he wrote the first word, we, or did it come into existence when he wrote the last word? Or did it come into existence the next morning when he read it out to the assembly? Or maybe after everyone signed it? So when we really examine very closely, we can't pinpoint, you know, this was when the United States started. And of course, other people might argue, well, it wasn't even existing then. You know, the British didn't recognize it. It wasn't until the end of the war and they wrote the Constitution, and then the United States started. So, you know, we can talk about it. We can make correct and incorrect statements, but when we kind of zoom in on it and try to find it, we can't find it. So this is why I've posted this picture of Peter Fonda. Some of you might know this famous hippie movie, Easy Rider from 1969. So I think this caption is perfect. We have, I don't know if you can read it, it's a little blurry. It says, "A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere." So I don't know if Peter Fonda, or I think his name was Wyatt in the film, I don't know if Wyatt was a yogi who was trying to locate the basis of designation for America. But basically Wyatt had this conception of America. And he wanted to find something that corresponded to his conception, and he couldn't find it. He rode all over in his motorcycle, but he never found what he was looking for. He found that everywhere he looked, it was very different than the America he envisioned. So this sums up what happens when we really look at things. We have a particular concept of it, but when we look at all of its parts, really break it down, it exists in a very different way than how it appears to our mind. So then we might say, well, okay, a country is, again, kind of a conceptual construct, but then we have a physical thing like a boat. I can point to this physical boat and, you know, I can break a boat. You know, I can smash it with a hammer or cut it with a saw, and it's no longer a boat. So the reason I've used the example of boat is because there's a very nice explanation of this by the Western philosopher, the Scottish philosopher, David Hume. Some of you might have heard him say this, that when we talk about identity, we have a boat here. So imagine if I had a boat for 20 years. And every year, you see this is a very simple boat made of wooden planks. So every year, one of the planks broke and I replaced it. And after 20 years, all of the new planks that had been used as replacements were different from the planks that had been there when the boat was first there, when I first purchased the boat or built it. Say, is it the same boat? So this is meant to be a kind of, you know, riddle, maybe you'd say, or paradox, but we'd say, is it a boat or not? Some people might say different things. Is it the same boat? So in middle way philosophy, this isn't actually very difficult. We'd say, yeah, of course it's the same boat because we consider it the same boat. Other than that, there was nothing else to begin with that constituted the boat. None of those particular pieces of the boat was the boat, and none of them altogether was the boat. But we have a conception of a boat, and it's correct to say it's still the same boat because we agree on it, and it, you know, has some kind of continuity that we've drawn. Whereas if somebody stole this boat and then replaced it with an identical boat, I might come out in the morning and say, oh, there's my boat. Actually, I'm wrong. Even though I think it's the same boat, I'd be negated by reasoning If somebody could point out to me, look, I have this CCTV camera, I can show you overnight, somebody came and took your boat, it's a different boat, then you're wrong. But nobody can really prove to me with conventional reasoning that this boat I had 20 years ago and the boat I have now are different. Otherwise, you'd have to say that me as a 5-year-old child and me now are two different people. Because again, all of the parts of my body have been regenerated and are different. Conventionally, it's the same. But when we look deeply at it and analyze it, we can't identify anything that holds that in that identity. So some of the other schools of Buddhism would argue that things like countries especially, but even boats, are what they call imputed existence, meaning that they exist independent upon parts that are not themselves those things. The parts of boat are not themselves a boat. But they would say that things like colors are substantial, meaning that it's composed only of parts of itself. If you have the color red, they talk about red as existing atomistically, that there is little red atoms that group together to form the red that we see. But every one of them individually is red. So in order for red to appear to our minds, it doesn't require anything else appearing that's not red. But again, the middle way school says this is incorrect. And I'm going to show it more with the modern scientific understanding of light, which is different than obviously in ancient India. They had some quite sophisticated ways of talking about matter. But generally speaking, I think that the modern modern physics has an even more sophisticated way of talking about matter. So we'd say that we have different steps here up until the last step. You see the red is actually meant to indicate that you see red, that it's appearing to your mind. So we have the first step, there's the light rays coming off of the sun. And then we have the second step, these light rays are coming towards Earth. These light rays, being different wavelengths or different frequencies of light that constitute a spectrum. And then these reach the Earth into the atmosphere and they reflect off of this little bird. Now, what really happens, if any of you know anything about the physics of light, what's really happening is that the feathers of the bird are absorbing every wavelength in the spectrum except for red. So really it's just reflecting the red. Everything else is being absorbed, which is why if you wear dark clothing, you feel hotter because it absorbs more of the light. And then from that, you see this shaft of light. It doesn't quite seem so on the screen, but it's meant to be a red shaft of light. So only that red shaft of all the different wavelengths is coming off the bird. And then this hits a person's eye. Now from the eye, then in the retina, it is then transferred into the visual cortex in the brain. And from that, we have then this appearance of red to the mind. Now how that works is actually not agreed upon in science in terms of the last step. What is the difference between it being processed in the visual cortex versus having the qualia, the appearance of red. But in any case, of these 6 steps, or it's actually 7 steps, we'd say, is any of those red? So take, for example, the second step, we have these wavelengths of light. But is that wavelength of light red? So for example, imagine somebody is colorblind and they can see blue, but they can't see red. So I say to you, well, you know what red is like? It's just imagine blue, but the wavelength's a little longer. Then do you think they'd have an idea of what red looks like? And no, because we're not seeing lengths of waves. We're seeing a qualia, a qualitative experience. And then we'd say, well, that bird is red. But again, as I said, the bird actually is absorbing every color except for red. It's just that the feathers are absorbing those other colors, so those are wavelengths. And then this shaft of light comes out and hits the eye. And then, in the visual cortex, there's this process experience. So again, is that red? So some scientists actually say, yes, it is. For example, some scientists will show the correlates of the neural correlates of the experience of sadness, and say those neural correlates constitute sadness. But this again becomes problematic. Is that identical to red? So I would argue, if the neural correlates which we see in the brain when we know somebody is sad constitute sadness, then in the same way, a frown should constitute sadness, because a frown is a physical correlate with somebody experiencing sadness. But the frown, we'd say, is not exactly the experience of sadness. It's just something that's present when sadness is present. So to say these neural correlates of sadness, it's a question of what does that really mean? And then maybe we'd say, well, okay, but then those neural correlates, lead to this experience of red, and that experience of red is red, this last piece. But then the problem is, so is red just a mental experience? There's no external thing called red? And actually, one of the Buddhist schools, the mind-only school, would say, yes, there is no experience. There's no thing external called red. It's merely an appearance to mind. But the middle way school says that conventionally, that's not true, because that's not how we talk about it. If you said that, then you'd have to say everything is just a mental experience. You'd say the bird is also just a mental experience, and the sun is also just a mental experience. Conventionally, we can talk about them, but when we look for them, we can't find them. So then the next example, you'll be a little shocked by this one, a person. So I'm not trying to demonize anybody here. This isn't the purpose of this picture. Actually, what I'm trying to show here is that we have 3 different news stories from this year, major pieces of news. So of course we have COVID-19, and then we have Donald Trump, and then we have wildfires in California. So some of you might see this central picture and feel angry. I think a lot of people felt quite angry at our president. Some of you might support him. I'm not trying to make a political statement one way or the other, so maybe you feel happy when you see him. But the point is that we feel some emotion. So somebody might see the COVID and they might see the wildfires, they might feel afraid, but nobody feels angry. Nobody gets angry at the virus. Actually, some people look at COVID-19 and they get angry at Donald Trump. The same with the wildfires. So it shows that we process this differently. We feel like there's some kind of solid thing there that's Donald Trump that we can get angry at. That's not just a manifestation of different causes and conditions coming together. But then we can think about it more deeply. We can say, who is this person? Why is he acting this way? So this is one way of analyzing dependent origination. We could think that, imagine, I was born to the same parents. I had the same family, the same upbringing, the same biological construction, the same experiences in life. And would I have acted the same way? Is there anything that's inherent about me that's different? That it would say I wouldn't have done things that way. Now in Buddhism, we consider there's more to the puzzle. There's not just the biology. There's not just the life experience. We say nature and nurture in science, in psychology. There's also the mental continuum coming from the past life. But even in that case, it's not a self. What's coming from the past life, it's often compared to one candle lighting another. It's not the same thing. It's just a cause and effect relationship. So is there any person that we can then say, oh, that it's his fault. He did this. He made this decision completely without any relying on anything else, and therefore it's worth getting angry at him. Now, and also we can analyze the person in several different ways, and one also that's very helpful is think about, when I say I, am I talking about my body or my mind? Now try to analyze what appears to us. So if I say I'm sick, right? I have COVID. I don't say my body has COVID and my body is sick. I say I'm sick. So there's a sense that this body is me. But then if I feel sad, I don't say my mind is sad. I say I'm sad. So there's a sense that my mind is me. But then sometimes I would say my body is sick. I say this life is coming to an end. My body is sick, but I feel okay. I feel happy. Or I might say my hand is in a lot of pain. Or I might, if my hand is in pain, I could also say I'm in pain. So sometimes it appears to me as something different from me that I possess. Sometimes it appears as it is me. So where is this person? Is this person the body, the mind, the collection of the two, or something different that's like a puppeteer that's controlling them? We have to look, first of all, how that appears to us, and then ask about, is that appearance correct? Can it be findable? So if I was the collection of body and mind, was there any logical inconsistency with that? Well, one thing would be that if you were looking at me on the screen now, you say, well, I see Tenzin Gache, right? But you don't see my mind. So if I was the collection of my body and my mind, you shouldn't be able to see me. You can only see part of me, but to say you see me would be incorrect. And likewise, you could say that you saw me when I was 10 years old and you remember me, but it's a very different body from what it is now. And the mind is also constantly changing. So then we might say, as some religions do, and I'll talk about this also as we get into the text, that that it's something different, that there's this self that's different than the body and mind. That's like the controller or the owner. But then the problem is, well, what is that? Can it appear to our minds? If we imagine there's no more body, throw that away, throw away my mind and all my experiences, all my memories of my life, is there anything there that's left that we can say, oh, that's me? So some people might say, well, the consciousness is this conscious experience. This is probably the most subtle argument. But then we have to get into what is the nature of consciousness. We just said we threw away the mind, right? So are we saying that mind and consciousness are different? If we don't have love and hate, attachment and anger, is there something that's there beyond them, that's different from them? So this is a very subtle point. It's something to reflect on. But essentially in this school of understanding, it's understood that it's not really separate. That although the mind can be free of these things, it's not that the mind is also different from them. So for example, if we had water that's very turbulent, the water can then become still and calm. But there was never any water separate from the turbulence to begin with. It's not like you take the turbulence, throw that away, and now the water is there. It's simply that the water is changing the way that it's behaving. But it's not something different than the turbulence or the wetness of the water. So I just want to say before we go to the next slide, we have this idea then that a person is merely, a manifestation of causes and conditions. So the question might be, well, then is Buddhism saying, that we shouldn't, if getting angry is therefore incorrect, should we not, do something to punish somebody? A lot of people felt that our president was behaving inappropriately. Should we just say, oh, it doesn't matter, nothing matters, there's no reason to get angry? That's not the understanding here. It's like the same thing with the fire. We should put out the fire, but we do it without this strong sense of projecting something more than is there. So Nagarjuna himself, he talks about this in Precious Garland. He says, just as you would wish to make a troubled son amend his ways, correct them with compassion, not with hatred, nor for gaining wealth. So we see, when we understand dependent origination, which really means we understand emptiness, then we act more appropriately. We don't get all out of our heads with anger and attack people in a way that's disproportionate to the situation, but we can take the appropriate measures to deal with the situation. Okay, so now I want to talk about, this emptiness, and now that we've talked about the object of negation and what emptiness means, why is it? How can this be meaningful for us? How can this matter, whether things exist inherently or not? So I'll talk a little bit about modern philosophy and modern psychology and how emptiness philosophy could be applied to these. So there are some unresolved issues in philosophy and science these days. A lot of people aren't even aware that these issues are unresolved. Some people might feel that science has already solved these mysteries. But the first one is called the fine-tuning of the universe. So some of you might know about this. What this means is that it's been quite conclusively determined that the laws of the universe are what we call anthropomorphic, meaning that they're very fine-tuned to support life and just matter in general. So we have things like the speed of light or the level of attraction between protons in an atom and a nucleus. If these things were slightly different, if the speed of light was slightly slower, if the attraction of protons was slightly stronger, then all matter in the universe would collapse and wouldn't be able to form these, these very complex, agglomerations, atoms, molecules, then complex matter, which then evolves into life. So it seems that somehow the universe is like perfectly fine-tuned for these things. So why is that the case? So generally speaking, nowadays, there's two main arguments. One is that God created the universe, that this was all designed by somebody who designed it exactly to be this way, to fit this way. The other argument, by most scientists who don't want to invoke God as an explanation, is that, well, it's just random, but it's because there was more than one universe. There's no, unless it was just an incredibly fortuitous chance that this one universe was exactly right, we could say that before the Big Bang, there was other universes going back billions and billions and billions. And it just happened that one of these universes, the laws was right, and that they therefore evolved into life. But basically everyone agrees that one of these has to be the explanation, that there is something going on here. Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, he says it's like there were all these scrap universes before, and ours just happened to be the one that worked, and we evolved in this one. So I think the reason I'm presenting this is that in Buddhism, we have the understanding of karma, that it's somehow a middle way between these two. Things aren't random, but there's also not one person that just designed it, because there's all kinds of problems with the creator God that designed everything. Mainly that, well, then who designed him or her or it? It becomes like another step where it then begs the question, where did that come from? But in Buddhism, we have the understanding that things arise in relation to experience and mind. But there's no creator. It's still just a natural process. And I'll talk about that soon when I talk about karma. And similarly, with the emergence of life from dead matter, we all agree, and most people agree, that humans evolved from apes. Apes evolved from lower life forms, and you stretch it back to bacteria, to amoebas, different one-celled organisms, and then bacteria don't even have cells. So we have the first life on Earth, but where did that come from? Most biologists will say, well, we know it came, eventually particles mixed and mixed and mixed, and then they became organic particles, which emerged into, into life. But this is actually a mystery how this happened. The great physicist Richard Feynman said, if I can't recreate something, then it shows I haven't really understood it. So far, no scientist has created life in a lab. We have cloned things, which means we take one life and create another life from it. But no scientist has taken dead matter and had it evolve into life. And what's actually even more astonishing, if we think about it, first of all, life emerged on planet Earth quite soon after the Earth cooled, within less than 1 billion years, soon, relatively speaking. But it's not just that all these things mixed and then suddenly there was an organic particle. All these things mixed and suddenly there was an organic particle that could reproduce itself. So that's a lot less likely than just simply having an organic particle. And then that reproduced and then other life evolved. So again, I'm not suggesting that Buddhism has the answer to this. It's not like Nagarjuna and these other philosophers talked about these things, but Buddhist understanding of life, that life is something that's not just necessarily connected with matter. And therefore, if a being has karma to incarnate in a physical form, then the physical form also responds to that karma and will move in a certain direction on the basis of that. And likewise, with the emergence of consciousness and intelligence, it's a big question in science. Where does consciousness come from matter? How so? When? And what animals can we point to that are conscious and which ones are not? And they're just simply, in a human being, when someone is born, is their mind a product of their brain? Is it the same as their brain? Is it something different than their brain? This is a major debate in science. And this is something that Buddhist philosophy talks about a lot and has a lot of insight into. Things that are, a lot of the debates that are going on nowadays in science are actually very similar to what were happening in ancient India. But there's a very, very strong, say, materialist or physicalist approach in science. It's almost considered like heresy to go outside of that. Just to give one example, there's a quite controversial British biologist named Rupert Sheldrake, some of you might have heard of. And when he first published his theory called morphic resonance, which is purporting to describe some of these, how these things work, the fine-tuning, the emergence of life, all of this, then the editor-in-chief of Science magazine, this great magazine in America, said, first of all, we should burn his books. And then when people challenged him on this, he said, well, because he's a heretic, and we therefore, just like the church, when someone's a heretic, we excommunicate them from the scientific community. So this shows very strongly that talking about these things is taboo. That to say that the mind is a non-physical thing, it's very hard to get a career out of doing that. There are some people who do, but a lot of people, when they talk about Buddhism even, they try to avoid talking about that because it seems, they don't want to be labeled as non-scientific, which really means non-materialistic. It's different. Science is an approach to understanding. It's not necessarily a body of knowledge or especially it's not a theory of how things are. It's a way of approaching, gaining knowledge. And then the last point we have here is memory, which is very important in Buddhism and also a big mystery in science. What is memory and how is it stored? Where is it stored? So anybody who's a materialist has to, by default, say it's stored in the brain. But so far, there has been no coherent theory, or not, I shouldn't say coherent, but no agreed upon theory that can show where it is in the brain or how. We used to think that it sort of like writing in the brain or something. That's definitely not the case. But there's different theories nowadays that contradict each other. Some people think it's stored in individual neurons, store memories. Some that it's a connection between different neurons. But none of them has actually been able to demonstrate exactly how it happens. And some of them have problems, experimentally. For example, we say that the hippocampus, part of the brain, is responsible for storing new memories. Now, it seems quite clear that if an adult human has their hippocampus damaged, they can no longer form new memories. There's a very famous case of this called this person HM, as the initials, whose hippocampus was damaged in a surgery. And for the rest of his life, he couldn't form new memories. He could remember everything that happened before the surgery, but he couldn't remember anything that happened since then. However, if a child's hippocampus is damaged, sometimes the other parts of the brain can take over that function. There's a case of a person in England who almost had no brain. This sounds absurd, but he was born with a disorder where most of the brain was water. And there were just a little bit of matter, bits of matter near the scalp, near the skull, the top. And he functioned perfectly fine. And at the time of the study was done in the 1980s, he was actually at a British university studying mathematics. So it seems that if it's done early enough in life, different parts of the brain can take over a function to different other parts of the brain. So it's not necessarily that one part of the brain is responsible for memory. It's simply that for people who have grown up that way with their brain functioning that way, then the brain doesn't have, we say, enough plasticity at an older age to fix itself. But it's not necessarily that a particular part of the brain is responsible for memory. There's also some experiments that have been done, for example, with caterpillars. Some of you might know that a caterpillar, at a certain point in its life cycle, it will dissolve into mush. I don't know if that's a scientific way to put it, but it will just, all of the parts of the body will just dissolve into this cocoon and emerge as a butterfly. So if there's any physical storing of memory, it should be wiped away. But there have been some studies showing that, for example, you expose a caterpillar to a particular light and at the same time as you cause some experience of pain, so they begin to associate the light with the pain. And then the butterfly sees that same light and is averse to it. So it's almost like there's this carryover of memory. So it's a question of what memory is. And again, I will, when I talk about karma soon, if there's time in this talk, otherwise it'll have to be in the next talk, I will talk about how important memory is in Buddhist philosophy. So then the other question that might come up is, okay, so you have this theory, of the mind being separate from the body, different thing, as Buddhism asserts that karma and the mind is different. That it's not unrelated to physical, but it's not a physical thing. But if there's no evidence for it, then there's no reason, it's just a theory, it's just an idea. Is there any evidence pointing to that? So I want to show some of that with what's called rogue evidence, meaning that evidence that's been collected that doesn't fit into the modern scientific paradigm. So I have mainly 6 groups of this. There's actually others, but these are the ones that I generally talk about that I think are the most important. So the first is what we call PSI, PSI. It's like a technical term in the field. Other people might know it from the original term ESP, extrasensory perception, which was coined by the Professor J.B. Ryan at Duke University in the 1940s. But nowadays in the field, they call it psi, which basically means one of 2 things. Either passive psi, which means the ability to know information that you could not have accessed through normal channels, and active psi, which means the ability to control things. So like we say psychokinesis, like moving objects around or causing somebody else to have some particular thought. So in Buddhism, this is actually quite important. And there's actually a lot of evidence for this. Of these 6 things that I presented, I think the strongest evidence is for psi. In the field of psi, which again, I said it's not a major field of science because people are a little afraid to get involved. If you have that on your resume, you won't get a job. And that's not just a joke, that's quite serious. Some of these people were actually expelled from the universities that they worked in just for doing this work. But within the field, it's not considered a question, does psi occur? It's considered, it does. It's very obvious from the evidence. It's just how does it occur? Yet still, there's a lot of people who will deny it, and most people just don't know about it. So for all of these things, I don't really have time to go into all these in detail, but if at the end of everything, I will, if people want, I can share resources because there's a lot you can read about this if you'd like to know about it. The next is near-death experiences and related phenomena. So some of you might have heard about this. It's when somebody, physically the body dies, and then they were revived, usually in a hospital, and they report some experience from during the time when they were supposed to have been dead. So actually, it really should be called after-death experience because clinically they're dead. So this was first reported, and it's been reported throughout human history, but in terms of scientific gathering of the evidence, it started in the 1970s. But the first evidence was really just, we say, anecdotal. People would talk about, oh, I had this experience once. So it's very easy to dismiss, even though it's quite interesting. But this is becoming more and more something that people are researching, especially because there's more and more people are being resuscitated. It's more common now. And there's been some very interesting studies where they don't just ask people 30 years later, can you tell me about your near-death experience? But there's especially one researcher in Holland who was a cardiologist. And for many years, any person he resuscitated, he would then give them a questionnaire. So then it becomes that you're getting some kind of demographic evidence and you can show things. And there's a lot of strong evidence for this, that there's some conscious experience going on when the person is clinically dead. And I say related phenomena because another important thing is what they call deathbed visions, which means that somebody who is on the verge of dying has a particular vision that they talk about to the people who are around them. And sometimes these things can be quite extraordinary. You know, one of the most amazing of these cases was the child who then reported he was seeing his dead sister, and his parents said that your sister's not dead. But then they later found out she had died somewhere else. And also what we say, I forget the word for it, but it's like if I have a relative die, and then I see them appear to me, and they tell me I've died. This is actually very common, not like 100% or anything like that, but a lot of people report this. So these are again things that, according to the materialist viewpoint, couldn't happen, so they're usually denied. The next is even harder, is reincarnation. But there's been a lot of studies of this, especially Ian Stevenson is definitely the most thorough study. This person, Ian Stevenson, for 50 years, was doing studies of children who claim to recollect past lives. And again, I won't get into it. I think it's definitely worth reading about if you can. But just to say that there's a lot of cases where children report having been a particular person in the past without any ordinary means of access to that information. And then it's, they later through research discovered that this person existed, and the details, a lot of them are correct. The next is tukdam, which tukdam is actually a Tibetan word for meditation. But this means that somebody who is a meditator dies in a state of meditation, and then they stay in that state. This actually happens quite frequently in our monastery. An old monk will pass away, and then for some period of time, a few days or even a few weeks, the body will stay there without any sign of decay. And as you see the picture I have here, this was of Geshe Jampa Gyatso, a monk from Sarai, who passed away earlier this year in Taiwan. You can see it this year because they all have the face masks. And then this team of Taiwanese researchers, they investigated for 8 days. They tested his body, and it did not show any of the normal signs of decay. And even without a scientific team, you should be able to smell. After even about 12 hours, you could probably notice something. But for 8 days, there's no sign of decay of the body. And other, they test the metabolism, other things. So this happens, as I said, quite frequently. Not like every person, but a couple times a year it happens. We hear about it in the community. And a number of times now, there have been researchers who have been investigating these things. The next is advanced states of meditation. So for Buddhism, of course, this is very important, because for Buddhism, what the Buddha called his enlightenment, according to the materialist paradigm, shouldn't happen. Somebody shouldn't be able to stop all the sense desire, for example. This body, we say, is biological, and it comes through evolution. So if somebody doesn't have desire for sexual pleasure, then they've basically destroyed the whole purpose of living, because the purpose of living is to procreate and continue the race. So there's something wrong with that. Okay, so you could say, oh, well, he's somehow blocking it out of his mind. But the Buddha said this was actually an extraordinary and happy experience. What is going on here? And then more practically, there have been studies of meditators these days, showing that meditators have a lot of things, not ordinary meditators. There are ordinary meditators who show, for example, less prone to anxiety or stress, but not like categorically different from ordinary people. But there are some advanced meditators who have been shown to have, states of, for example, brain function, brain waves through an EEG that do not fit into the scientific paradigm, that unexplainable from what most neuroscientists would understand of what the brain is supposed to do. So again, this doesn't necessarily prove that the mind is something non-physical, but it suggests that currently our paradigm is incomplete. And then the last one, we have ghosts, mediums, and possession, which is probably, for a lot of people, this is going to be the most challenging if you don't already feel some kind of affinity for this. But there's actually, beyond just people having weird visions, there is quite a fair amount of evidence for this, and people who have researched this. And so ghost would mean that people see, what they say as a spirit, something that's not a physical being. A medium would be somebody who claims to be able to communicate with non-physical beings. And then possession would be when, it seems that a person is being controlled by something else, some other force beyond their own ordinary consciousness. And in all three of these cases, I don't want to get into it because I'm already running short of time, but if people would like, I'm happy to provide plenty of different points, different research on this that you can read about. So in all of these cases, if you research it, you'll also find plenty of people saying this is all just a hoax, or debunking these things, they say. So I think, there's different ways to approach that. It's very important to be skeptical and not just accept things from how they seem immediately. But it's also important not to be over skeptical where you just say, oh, this can't happen, and therefore it's not the truth, which in most cases seems to be what's happening. For example, the reincarnation, a lot of these cases just seem, how could this possibly have happened if there wasn't reincarnation? And so the explanation that's given by people trying to debunk it is, it must have been fraud. This child who claims to remember this past life, it must have been that the parents somehow met with these people who knew the other person, acquired this information, told the child, and the child was play acting and pretending he remembered this past life. Now that's very unlikely. I mean, why would they do that? How would they have contacted these people? How could they get the child to act so, so like this really happened? It's just a 2-year-old child. But that's more likely than that it was reincarnation, because that just can't happen. So we have to just go with the explanation of fraud. And in most of these other cases, that's also what's happening. People would say with Tukdam, it must be that the people were injecting some kind of preservative into the body and not telling us, because there's no other way that could happen. In the case with Sai, it must be that they're just making up these results. They couldn't have happened. So I want to just mention, in science, some of you might have heard of Occam's razor, which means that the simplest explanation, is usually the one that we should go with. It doesn't mean it's always the case. We can consider other explanations, but it's a very simple explanation to say the mind is a non-physical thing, and all of these things can occur and they make sense. And in Buddhist philosophy, all of these phenomena I just mentioned are explainable and fit into the philosophy. And there's no question, there's no like big issue, how does this happen? Because it makes sense. Or the other, that would be, we'd say, Occam's razor. It's cutting it down to a very simple explanation. Or we have a very convoluted explanation where Sai is the result of all of this fraud. Near-death experiences are the result of these chemical processes in the brain that, although we can't explain them, they must be happening. And then these people having all these delusions and making too much out of something that, that is, even though they say it was the most powerful experience of my life, they're just deluding themselves. And that a reincarnation, that this person, Ian Stevenson, who was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia, is just a hack. And he's just making up all these stories and being deluded by all these people who tell them they remember reincarnation. They remember their past lives. And Tukdam, that the whole Tibetan society is a big hoax. And they're just making up all these things, and they're all in on this big charade that they're doing to make it look like people that are dead are still not decaying, and so forth. So the point is that, it becomes very convoluted that, okay, maybe all that's the case, but can you show any reason to show, to explain that? Any evidence that that's happening? Anyway, I'm getting a little bit, I'm running out of time. So I think, my point has come across, but I think this is very important to consider, because if we talk about karma in the context of emptiness, it's good to see that it's not just a theory that, okay, that's a nice theory, but it helps to explain a lot of things. These are scientific findings, and scientific evidence should be considered in a context. Any theory should be able to explain everything that happens, and not just say that all of those things are all just made up. So then I want to also focus a little bit on quantum mechanics, because I think this is something that within science, it allows some possibility for how we could explain this. I'm not saying that quantum mechanics therefore proves karma. That's much too strong of a statement. But it at least allows for the possibility that mind is a non-physical entity. Whereas in classical mechanics, classical physics, we say Newtonian physics, it's just absolutely impossible. There's nowhere to fit a mind, a non-physical mind, into the universe. It can't affect matter. If it could, then all of Newtonian physics would fall apart, because everything should be predictable from other physical matter. And a lot of people nowadays still think that science cannot accommodate a non-physical mind. But actually, that's based on classical physics. And we now know that classical physics is not actually true. It's an approximation of how things are. So in quantum mechanics, I just want to quote, this is from a book called Quantum Enigma, you see, by Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner, they're specifically writing a book to show that quantum mechanics suggests that mind could be non-physical. We don't know how, but this is actually a question in science. So we say many physicists dismiss this mystery as irrelevant for all practical purposes and best not emphasized. It displays physics' encounter with consciousness. Its discussion can be embarrassing. It's been called our skeleton in the closet. What's unphysical? From its inception, quantum theory involved the observer. To account for the demonstrated facts, quantum theory has the observation of an object instantaneously influencing the behavior of other distant objects, even if no physical force connects them. Quantum theory also has the existence of an object at a particular place where it is observed become an actuality only upon its observation. But then what constitutes an observation? So we say observation, some of you might know, but we say the quantum collapse, that only when we choose to observe a particular aspect of something does the different probabilities collapse into one event. But what does it mean to observe something? It's not clear. Moreover, they say it's not clear, meaning what I'll talk about in a minute on the next slide is it the measurement device, or is it the person observing it? And if it's the person observing it, it is their brain, or is it their mind, or what does that mean? What does it mean to make an observation? Moreover, as quantum phenomena are now being demonstrated with even larger objects, this quantum measurement problem gets increasing attention both by physicists and in popular treatments. And finally, this is important, observation cannot be separated from awareness and therefore from consciousness. These two concepts themselves involve some mystery, but we must be careful. Any broad-ranging discussion of a physics encounter with consciousness walks the edge of a slippery slope. We therefore work to distinguish the demonstrated facts from speculation. And this is what I was saying, that I think that quantum mechanics provides a platform, a way that we could understand the Buddhist philosophy in the context of modern science. But it's going too far to say that it therefore proves it. Some people will say that, and I think that's too strong of a statement. And they say, of course, from pseudoscience. So we don't want to come up with scientific theories that are too kind of theoretical and not based on clearly definable evidence and, we say testable theories, falsifiable theories. So then the question is, are there people who have tried to come up with explanation of quantum mechanics that account for the mind? And one of them is John von Neumann, who some of you might know. And the reason I talk about von Neumann is because he's actually very important in quantum mechanics. Von Neumann was a Hungarian man who emigrated to the United States. And in the 1940s, he actually helped the United States significantly to develop the hydrogen bomb. And later, unfortunately, died of radiation poisoning as a result. But apart from that, he was also very instrumental in the foundation of our modern understanding of quantum mechanics. We have, as some of you might know, what we call the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was found by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in Copenhagen in the 1930s, or 1920s, 1930s. And that is kind of the orthodox, we say, the orthodox understanding of quantum mechanics. And von Neumann himself followed this interpretation, but he developed it further. He developed a lot of the precise mathematics that are involved in calculations of this. But he had a different understanding of it than Bohr and Heisenberg did, because Bohr and Heisenberg said, well, what causes a quantum collapse is a measurement object. You know, we put something there to measure it, and thereby it causes this collapse. And they were very explicit. You can't say how it happens. You just say it happens. But von Neumann said, well, if you take this further, well, the measuring device also is part of the system, has to keep going back and back until it comes to the experience of the observer. And therefore, it's related to conscious experience. So I'll read here. In a chapter of the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics, von Neumann deeply analyzed the so-called measurement problem. He concluded that the entire physical universe could be made subject to the universal wave function. Since something outside the calculation was needed to collapse the wave function, von Neumann concluded that the collapse was caused by the consciousness of the experimenter. He argued that the mathematics of quantum mechanics allows the collapse of the wave function to be placed at any position in the causal chain, from the measurement device to the subjective consciousness of the human observer. So the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation has been summarized as follows. The rules of quantum mechanics are correct, but there's only one system which may be created with quantum mechanics, namely the entire material world. There exist external observers which cannot be treated with quantum mechanics, namely human and perhaps animal minds. And the italics are actually his, it's not mine, which perform measurements on the brain, causing wave function collapse. So it's basically suggesting that somehow the conscious observer, that the mind is non-physical. It's by definition non-physical because it has to be outside of the system, the physical system. So one modern physicist who's developed this theory further is Henry Stapp. He's still alive, he's quite old now. Another one, some of you may have heard of David Bohm. I'm not going to talk about him. There was a discussion about his work earlier this year in Nalanda. You could watch that, or there's a movie about him called Infinite Potential that came out this year. And he was a friend of His Holiness Dalai Lama, who had his own interpretation. But I want to focus on Henry Stapp because I think his is by far the closest to Buddhist philosophy and is the most compatible with it. And Henry Stapp was a student of Wolfgang Pauli, who is also a very important early physicist, contemporary of von Neumann, or early quantum physicist, I should say. So we're running out of time, so this will be our last slide. And then I just want to get through it though while we're on this subject. So first of all, Henry Stapp believes that classical physics cannot describe the brain and thinks that a quantum framework is needed for a full explanation. He is sympathetic to the pre-quantum age ideas of William James. So some of you might know William James, the philosopher, psychologist at Harvard. Many people consider William James the greatest psychologist in American history. He died in 1910, so he was so early part of the 20th century. And James himself was very sympathetic to a non-materialist explanation of mind. This has actually been explicitly written out of his textbooks. His textbooks are still read at Harvard, where he taught, but they actually removed the parts of his textbooks that talk about psi phenomena and about non-material explanation of mind, because they don't fit into the current paradigm. But William James has the idea that essentially what consciousness is intention. That there's a variety of possibilities will appear to conscious awareness based perhaps on physical processes in the brain. But among those possibilities, consciousness is what decides which one to do. And this isn't just speculation, it's based on a lot of evidence about how the mind works. So for example, we say the fight or flight response, right? So I'm walking on the road and there's a tiger there. I'm terrified. And immediately two possibilities appear to my mind. I could run away or I could fight, say I have a gun, I could fight the tiger. But all the details of those don't appear, just a possibility. It appears I could run away, I start running away. I don't have to think about every single individual thing I do. I put my foot here, this far ahead. If I did that, I'd just collapse because it would be too complicated. It's like my brain is doing most of this on autopilot, we'd say. But my conscious awareness is enough to just say, I want to do this and not do that. It also has to do with how we process language. Somebody who knows a language, you see the word Henry Stapp here. You don't have to think Henry. It's not how it appears to your mind. It just appears Henry. Somebody who's learning a language for the first time has to do that. But things appeared to us, in a kind of, connected fashion. And so the conscious element of it is not to have to go through every detail, but it's the making a decision based upon different possibilities. And this is, I said, very close to Buddhism, because in Buddhism, we say this mental factor of intention is karma. Most Buddhist schools say that the mental factor of intention is synonymous with karma. That the decision to do one action as opposed to another is a karmic action. So Henry Stapp tries to apply William James's theory of the mind to quantum mechanics, to say that a number of possibilities, we say this wave function that has different possibilities of what could happen, appear to conscious awareness, and we choose one. And what we choose then causes the collapse of the wave function and causes how reality then unfolds. So therefore, the brain is not the mind. The brain is also part of the physical universe, and therefore, the way that the mind controls the brain is not like the way that I control the cup that I'm holding and I move it around physically. It has to do with choosing a particular possibility among many that therefore causes the collapse in the wave function. So with respect to the brain and consciousness, Stapp considers that some brain processes, such as the calcium ions that are involved in the release of neurotransmitters at synapses, need to be treated quantum mechanically. That this is a gross physical system, we say. I mean, ions is still very small, but it's something that it can't be explained by classical physics. It has a quantum element to it. Stapp sees the physical world as a structure of tendencies or probabilities within the unit world of the mind. He thinks that the introduction of an irreducible element of chance into nature via the collapse of the wave function, as described in most forms of quantum theory, is unacceptable. The element of conscious choice is seen by him as removing chance from nature. So here we have, as I said, there's many different interpretations of quantum mechanics. We know that it happens because it's extraordinarily accurate in making predictions. But what it means for something to collapse, what does that mean? It's not really clear. And some people will say it's just random. Why does one collapse happen versus the other? It's just random, which a lot of scientists don't like this. Famously, Einstein had said to this, that God does not play dice with the universe. That he doesn't like the idea that things are just random. So Stapp sees this as it's not random. He says that it's a conscious process. And consciousness also is not random, he says very clearly. Consciousness has its own trajectory of cause and effect from the past, but it's different than a physical process. It has a cause, but it's not a physical cause. Stapp envisages consciousness as exercising top-level control, meaning that consciousness is not created by neurons in the brain that build up and build up and build up, and then you have this overarching system called consciousness. It's actually that consciousness exerts a top-down effect on the other things, the less complex things. Over neural excitation in the brain. Quantum brain events are suggested to occur at the whole brain level rather than at the level of synapses. In this event, conscious events are selected from the larger excitation of the brain. He speaks of a creative event bringing into being one of a range of possibilities that exist in Heisenberg's quantum distribution of the probabilities. Stapp sees the physical world as a structure of tendencies or probabilities within the world of the mind. He thinks that the introduction of an irreducible element of chance into nature via the collapse of the wave function, as described by most forms of quantum theory, is unacceptable. The element of conscious choice is seen by him as removing chance from nature. So again, we're out of time, and I don't want to get into his theory very deeply. And honestly, I'm not an expert on physics either, so I can't get into his theory much more deeply. But if you want to read about, again, I will send a resource list at the end. I can send the name of some of his books. And I'm not necessarily saying he's right. You know, he is a major physicist. He's not just, you know, again, somebody who's kind of on the fringe of science. He's a very, you know, well-educated and important physicist, but, you know, he definitely could be wrong, and he has people criticize him, and he responds to it quite eloquently. But the point is that this is a possibility, that there's some opening, because if we then want to, you know, understand Buddhist, you know, philosophy and want to accept it, we have to have some sense that this could happen. Otherwise, if we have this sense that, you know, that the world, that we have Buddhist philosophy on the one hand, and then we have science, and they're totally contradictory and they can't incompatible, then it's a dichotomy in our minds. So it's something to really think about and to consider. And as I said at the beginning, this is the Nalanda tradition, that we apply Buddhist understanding to modern dilemmas. And we have to really think about things. We can't just accept it on faith, but we can think about how could this really happen. So with that, I'll leave this discussion. We're already going a bit over time. Our next, we'll start next with karma. Psychology. There's one little bit of psychology next I'll talk about next talk, and then talk about karma and the Buddhist philosophy, you know, and then we'll actually get into the text, the 70 stanzas. But I think it was, you know, hopefully to give an introduction as to why this is all useful, as opposed to just start saying, oh, a pot doesn't exist. You know, you might say, well, why does that matter? That's the big question. So we'll do a short dedication now, and then we'll come back again, I think 2 p.m. Indian time. So can we display this on the screen, the dedication prayers? And also I want to say, I'm sorry, we don't have any time for question and answer now. Hopefully we'll have in the future, in the next sessions. If we don't, also I'm hoping we can have a, you know, an online forum after the fact. If people have questions, they can post them online, and I can you know, respond in a public forum for everyone. So let's start now with the dedication prayers.